already at the first Sunday of Advent, as I mentioned in our greeting this morning. And normally when we think of Advent, we think of pink and purple candles. We think of the cozy nativity scene on Hallmark cards. We think of hope and love. We think of joy and peace. Never have I heard someone describe Advent as a thief in the night, prowling outside your house, stealthy and silent. And I'm glad I've never heard it that way, right? I've never heard anyone talk about Advent with images of broken doors, of shattered glass, and a stranger's footsteps on your stairs. Someone just waiting to take your most prized possessions, disappearing while you sleep. I've never heard it described this way, and yet, these are the images our gospel reading for the first Sunday of Advent gives us. A homeowner caught off guard. A house that's been broken into. The Son of Man coming at an unexpected hour like a thief in the night. And I think what's even more terrifying is that these images don't really mix well with the Jesus that we've come to know, the Jesus that we've come to love, the Jesus that we think we understand. The Jesus in the manger, the Jesus on the cross, the Jesus who feeds and forgives and heals and saves. Instead, the Jesus Matthew describes for us in our passage is no respecter of boundaries. He's not invested in the status quo. He doesn't care about keeping us secure and comfortable. The Jesus Matthew describes is actually an invader, an intruder, a disruptor even. I read this and I asked myself, what should we do with the Son of Man who describes himself as a robber? How should we respond to a Jesus who shows up and take things away from us, things that we care about, things we depend on, things we're 100% sure we can't live without? I think there's a lot we can learn from these challenging images. But here's three things that stood out to me as I wrestled with this passage this week. The first is that we need to recognize when we're asleep in our faith. We need to recognize when we're asleep in our faith. Jesus compares the coming of the Son of Man to the days of Noah's flood. And he says before the flood, they were eating and drinking. They were marrying and giving in marriage. Jesus says they knew nothing. They knew nothing. They were sleeping. They were going about life as usual until the flood came and swept them all away. I think it's so hard. It's so very, very hard to accept the fact that we're not awake, that we're missing those spiritual moments, those divine nudges, those times when the Spirit is trying to lead us, when Jesus is trying to say something to us. We miss them because we're fast asleep in the ordinary and the mundane. We want to believe that we're good just as we are. We want to believe that business as usual will be good enough to keep us in tune with God. We want to pretend that Christianity will never require anything hard or costly of us. Because usually what happens, I find, is that on our journeys with God, we find a pace. And we're comfortable with this pace. It's not too hard. It's not too challenging. And we start moving at that pace, and everything about our routines and our schedules start aligning with that rhythm. And somewhere along the spiritual journey, we become numb, sober. Somewhere along the spiritual journey, we become comfortable, complacent. We get used to this rhythm, this pace. And we love it because we're not really challenged. We love it because we don't really have to give up too much. We love this kind of faith this rhythm, slow and easy faith, because it's comfortable. Almost as if we're asleep in our faith. And yet, over and over again, Jesus reminds us that faith is alive. He reminds us that faith is active. He reminds us that faith is constantly pushing us beyond the boundaries that we set, beyond the limits that we believe are possible, beyond the possibilities we assume. The message of Advent in this first Sunday of the season is wake up. The message of Matthew in our lectionary reading is keep watch. The call of the season is to recognize that we're not paying attention to what really matters, to confess that we are alive and yet dangerously asleep. Jesus says in this season, wake up. The second thing I think this passage teaches us is that Advent is about surrendering our certainties. It's about surrendering our certainties. Jesus goes on in his teaching, and the point of the thief in the night analogy seems to be that Jesus isn't going to come in the way that we expect. And it's almost as if he's warning us that if we think we have everything figured out, if we think we're there already, that there's no more room to grow, that we have religion pinned down and we know everything there is to know, if we think we have Jesus all figured out, he says we're in for an unpleasant surprise, instructing us almost to surrender those certainties. Because oftentimes in our faith journeys, we can be so busy, we can be so focused, so certain in the direction that we're headed. But in the season of Advent, we experience this divine interruption. Christ is born. Jesus arrives. And his arrival interrupts those certainties. His arrival interrupts our goals. It reshapes our lives. It tunes our outlook on life. And just when we think we have it all figured out, he calls us to new paths, new sacrifices, new challenges, and new opportunities to grow. But oftentimes it's hard to grow and to accept this challenge when we're not willing to let go, to surrender these certainties, to surrender these false gods that we hold so close to our hearts. Jesus says in this season, if we confess that we don't even know what to look for or where to look for it, if we empty ourselves of all of these notions of God and train our hearts to expect the unexpected, that we can find Jesus where we least expect him to be. He says, if you can train your mind to expect the unexpected, that maybe, yes, even in our struggles and tears, Jesus can be expected. That yes, even in the hardships and the challenges, we can find Jesus. If we can believe that Jesus can show up even in these places and in those places where we think there is no hope or no possibility of Jesus showing up, if we can do that, then we will be able to receive the real Jesus with joy when he appears. The third thing I think this passage teaches us is that during the Advent season, we should prepare to be robbed. And it was kind of strange as I was writing this. We should prepare to be robbed, right? And I know it sounds strange, but think about it like this. Advent is all about preparation, about getting our lives, our hearts, and our souls ready. It's about making room, essentially, making space for the new life that is coming. That is what we're preparing for in Advent. And the question as we read this passage is, how can we make room if our hearts are already filled to the brim? And I thought to myself, maybe Jesus comes as a thief because we need to be robbed. Maybe Jesus breaks in because our valuables have become liabilities, and we need an intruder to sweep in and take what we won't willingly give up. which is something that we all know too well. And we've spoken about this in previous passages and previous sermons, how we've all experienced this confronting nature of Jesus and his gospel at some point in our lives. To put it simply, it's like Jesus never really takes a back seat. Jesus never really sits down. And we said that the moment he enters our lives, he starts moving around. And not just moving, we brought this up before, when we allow Jesus into our lives, he normally goes straight to the place that we don't want him to go to. It's the most uncomfortable thing we've talked about. He goes to places in our lives that he shouldn't go to. Turns over stones that we wanted left alone. Exposes bad habits that we locked up long ago. He calls out harmful habits that we told ourselves were okay. And the entire time we're trying to figure out what exactly is Jesus doing in my life. We're trying to figure out, and we're asking ourselves, I thought I could be Christian without the challenge to make a change to my character. I thought I could get Christ without the crucifixion, the title without doing any of the work. But Jesus doesn't let any of that happen. The moment you allow Jesus into your life, change is bound to happen. Because the moment Jesus is invited in, all of that junk, the greed, the anger, the violence, the fear, the things we've hidden away, too stubborn to let go of, too comfortable to see on our own, those things get shown to the door. And for many of us, that's a frightening thing. Jesus confronts things in our lives that we don't want to be confronted. And he asks us to let go of certain traits and characteristics, certain desires and habits, certain thoughts and actions that we don't want to let go of. Almost to rob us of these things. And so he becomes like a threat to us. He's challenging our way of life, being disruptive. And so I say again, maybe Jesus comes as a thief because we need to be robbed. We need an intruder to sweep in and take what we won't willingly give up. Because if these things inside of us are not confronted, there's really no stopping the amount of damage that we'll do to one another. If left unchecked, the power becomes a weapon. If we're not robbed of these things, love becomes lust. If we're not willing to give them up, life becomes one big rivalry, where everyone is looking out for themselves, getting as much as they can, as fast as they can, for as long as they can for themselves. And relationships become competitions. And we start hurting the people around us because of the hidden dangers inside of us. Maybe that's why Jesus comes as a thief in the night, to unravel, to break into these parts of our lives. And I think the question for us today is, what are we clinging to that Jesus needs to steal? Is it our apathy? Is it our self-righteousness? Is it our fears? Our inability to forgive one another? What is it in our lives that we are clinging so strongly to that in this season of Advent, Jesus might need to steal away from us? It's no coincidence that Jesus comes when we're asleep and vulnerable, I think. Because when else would we let go of these things that we cling so tightly to? It's hard to let go of these things. We've been battling with them our entire lives. And it's almost as if we need to be asleep for Jesus to rob us of these sort of things. In the end, I love that the gospel gets us started with images that startle us out of our complacency. The first Sunday of Advent, and we're not talking about swaddling clothes and twinkling stars and cute lambs, but the lectionary has us talking about Jesus as this relentless pursuer of our souls. Jesus as the thief in the night, using every method possible to snap his readers to attention. And he says, be on guard. He warns his disciples, be alert. Wake up. Stand up. Raise your heads. Open your eyes. Look. For in this season, we are waiting for Christ. And I know these aren't the soothing, comforting invitations we like to accept as we get ready to shop for gifts and decorate Christmas trees and sing carols. But as we've constantly been reminded, Advent begins in the dark. It's not a season for the faint of heart. Whether we like it or not, the invitations that Advent offers us are tough ones. They don't look pretty on greeting cards, but they're essential and they're life-giving nonetheless. They help us to prepare for the birth that is almost at hand. They help us to stay alert. They help us to receive Jesus in all of the shocking and scandalous ways that Jesus chooses to appear in our lives. Advent is here, and the waiting and the preparing, the journey begins today. Amen.